Uh, he also serves as the on the Central Valley Bird Club as a director and conservation chair and an editor of the Journal of the Central Valley Birds. And I've had the pleasure of meeting Dan, and I'm really pleased that he was able to present for us. So I'm going to turn it over to him. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you, Maricela. Appreciate that. Hi, everybody, and thank you for coming tonight. I'm going to talk to you, as promised, about purple martins in California. Um, I I'm not always sure somebody does a background, so real quickly, I'll just mention a few things. I'm a wildlife biologist by training. I'm a retiree, and I am now an independent researcher and conservation planner, which basically means I fund most of my own studies. But there is an exception that we'll talk about later. I've been working, as Maricela said, on bird and natural resource conservation issues, all in Northern California for the last, I guess it's 43 years now. And I began working on purple martins in 1991 in Sacramento without ever expecting to be continuing to work on them for so long, but here I am. I've worked extensively with martins at other sites throughout Northern California, including last year at Willits Bypass, which we'll talk about toward the end of the talk. And then I've also done some limited work with martins in Arizona, Washington State, and in the eastern US. So I probably am the state's expert on purple martins, but it's a pretty small club. Um, I thought I would start by giving you just a little introduction to martins. They're one of those species that are so rare that people don't generally know very much about them and aren't very aware of them. Your area in the North Coast is one of the few areas where people can see martins regularly. But they are the largest North American swallow. They are, of course, abundant and well studied in the East, where they use the apartment style nest boxes. In fact, all of the birds nesting in the Eastern North America nest in boxes. There are no naturally nesting populations left there. Um, they're much more common in the East and very much less common in the West. They're a cavity nester, so that means they're susceptible to nest site competition from the European starling and house sparrows, which is a conservation challenge, both of those being non-native species. They nest colonially, which creates some uh, issues with respect to what kinds of habitat is suitable, how do you find them, and how do you manage them. They are an aerial insectivore, so they take all of their prey on the wing, flying insects, which also, again, has conservation issues regarding things like pesticides that are affecting insect populations, as we know. And then this is just kind of a gee whiz fact. Unlike most other swallows, purple martins have a delayed plumage maturation in the males. So this bird at the bottom is actually the bird at the top is an adult male courting a adult female. The bird at the bottom is a subadult or second year adult, which you can recognize by a little bit of darker coloration on the side of the head, the purplish, and then some kind of randomly scattered purple feathers generally in the breast and belly. But they are lighter in the west than the east. Um, the I'm having trouble reading the top of my screen, so I apologize. Purple martin status in California. This species was designated as a species of special concern in 1978. Um, so almost 50 years ago. The threats identified at the time were habitat loss, competition with non-native or alien species, but notably pollution or pesticides was not really identified as a threat in the 2008 account that's I worked on with another individual to summarize the status of the species. In 1978, there's a book that was published on all of the species of special concern. And the Department of Fish and Wildlife said at the time they were committed to continued investment in population assessment and adaptive management as tools for effective conservation. Well, in fact, no assessment or really any statewide conservation actions have been taken on behalf of the purple martin until this year, which again I will talk about. So the ball was has sort of been dropped by the resource agencies at this point. Um, and most of the work that's been done on assessment and conservation and management has been done independently and locally by conservation groups, agencies, and individuals. So this is the breeding distribution from eBird. Photo I took off of my screen. It's not very good, but it gives you the general distribution of the entire species, all of its subspecies in North America above Mexico, because of course Mexico is part of North America, right? Um, but as you can see, the distribution is and abundance is a lighter and spottier in the west than out here in the east, where these dark colors indicate high abundance. So just to summarize some of the differences between the three subspecies that exist, there's the eastern martin, there's the desert or southwestern martin, and there is the western purple martin. The breeding range is shown here, eastern North America, the Sonoran Desert, where the birds nest in these saguaro cactuses almost exclusively. And then the western martins are along the Pacific and in montane areas in the west for the most part. They winter in different locations. The eastern martin goes to the Amazon. We're just getting a few satellite transmitters on desert martins. I say we, I'm not really doing it. But they're getting a few on to understand where those birds are going. Our western birds, the few that have been tracked, go to a completely different area from the eastern birds on the Atlantic coast of Brazil. The status and trends, the eastern martins are abundant, but they are declining slowly. And this probably relates to the dependence on humans and backyard nest boxes like these shown at the bottom here. And as the population ages and becomes more urban, the newer generation is not taking up the hobby as readily. And there's quite an effort to try to encourage new so-called landlords to come into the picture. The trend, the abundance of the desert martin seems to be pretty high, but it's really not been assessed. But there are threats, particularly the establishment of non-native grasses that are carrying fires in the Sonoran Desert region and killing the saguaro cactuses when the fires burn through there. In the western birds, we'll talk more about, but the population is low and the status is either declining in some areas or stable. This shows you the distribution of the western martin. So essentially north of the Sonoran Desert and west of the Colorado Rockies, both in montane areas in the Rockies, the basin ranges in Nevada and Utah, and then along the coast here. Apparently, all of these populations are the same subspecies. Just a few comparisons, the species, the eastern versus western. I mentioned some of this, but they're genetically distinct. The sort of genetic time clock says that these populations were mostly separated about 200,000 years ago during Ice Age. They're much less abundant. We probably have a population of about maybe 7,000 total birds in the entire western region versus 12 million. maybe that number 7,000 has gone up a little bit, and we'll know more after this year about what the California population is. But regardless, it's at least two, three orders of magnitude less abundant in the West. The plumage is different. So if you look at Sibley or National Geographic, oftentimes they only show the eastern birds, and the females here are much lighter in color. They don't have the grayish markings that you see. This is actually that same subadult male picture I showed before. They are larger by only a small amount, about 2 to 4% larger, the Western birds. And the main thing is they use different nest sites. They don't use the apartment style nest boxes that the Eastern Martins use. This shows you the distribution of what different nest site types are used within the range of the Western Purple Martin. And so as you can see here, as you move from north to south, the northern population was just about wiped out. And it's been brought back from very small numbers. In British Columbia, the population was as low as 30 birds. And it's now up, last that I heard, it's around 4,000, 100% in nest boxes. So they recovered that population. In Washington, it's about 80%, 80, 90% nest boxes, but there are a few in the forest. Interestingly, mainly at Fort Lewis, where they are the live fire training sets off a lot of fires and creates a lot of snags that maintains habitat for martins there. Oregon, it's about 50-50 and maybe a little more towards 75% boxes based on what I just heard a couple of days ago. But then look at California. Most of the birds, this is as of about 2 years ago, our knowledge was that almost all the birds were nesting in snags. About 10% are nesting in bridges. We only have had 4 nest box colonies in the last 20 years in California, and some of those are no longer active. I don't include, well, I'll just say I'm going to update this for you based on my review of eBird records that I did several months ago. In other Western states, it's all snags, Colorado and Utah. So let's zoom in one more level to the status of the birds in California. They were formerly considered locally common throughout the state. This would be Grinnell and Miller, who were the preeminent ornithologists who published the book, The Distribution of the Birds of California, in 1944. So they called them locally common in most areas of the state except high mountains and the desert. And they said that the range had expanded as the birds were colonizing buildings. So it used to be, and some of you may be old enough to remember, that there were city dwelling martins in most of the Central Valley towns. So Sacramento and the foothill towns, Sacramento, Auburn, Colusa, Chico, Oroville. Most of these towns had birds nesting in generally in tile roof buildings where they could use the holes created by those tiles and bred there. But unfortunately, in the late 1960s and early 70s, the European starling, non-native starling, arrived in California, excuse me, as a breeding species, and that very rapidly eliminated large numbers of martins and substantially shrunk their population. So that in Sacramento, in the Central Valley, for example, the only population that has remained since the 70s has been in Sacramento. They are now highly localized, except in the North Coast region, where they seem to be doing fairly well. But again, I'll get into this in a moment. This shows you the distribution as portrayed by eBird. And this really somewhat overstates the abundance just because of the size of the squares. They're really much more locally distributed, especially inland, whereas the distribution is relatively continuous in forested regions along in the coast. So what do we know about the status and population trend? I mentioned that there haven't been a lot of survey work done. Well, there really haven't been any comprehensive population surveys. Brian Williams, a master's student at Sac State, summarized all of the historical records of martins through 1998 for a master's thesis, um, and documented the declines that I just talked about. And then he and I put together the species of special concern account, which updated the abundance through 2004, although it took until 2008 for them to publish it. But that was estimated, the population then was estimated at about 1,300 to 1,800 nesting pairs in the state. In 2019, I was preparing to lead a statewide assessment of the status of martins, and our funding was pulled by the main funder, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, for unknown reasons. And so we limped ahead with some volunteers. Sarah Grimes, some of you may know, who lives out on the coast in Mendocino, was a big helper on this. And we put together a status assessment in Northern California. And then since then, there's been localized long-term or periodic monitoring at a few sites. And we get, of course, a lot of scattered records in eBird and places like that. And then this year, conducted a summary of the minimum numbers of nesting pairs based on eBird records, which I'll report on in a moment here. The 2009 population assessment is kind of our baseline for looking at the status where we had pretty good data. We evaluated the abundance at sites where we had adequate historical information. So we only really had 4 sites where prior to 2009, there was a reasonably good estimate of how many birds were present. Only 4 sites. We also looked at occupancy, though. We had a larger number of sites where we said, well, the martins are there. Are they still there? And that survey was conducted at about 45 sites in 15 different Northern California counties. So not comprehensive, but it set a baseline that we can use and plan to use this year to look at how the numbers have changed at these sites surveyed in 2009. So I'll just give you this is really a demonstration of how fragmentary the information is, but this is what we know about the sites where abundance was determined. Shasta Lake, overall, a scattering of surveys, but there's no indication of a decline there. It seems stable. Red Hills Road, we had 3 years of data. These dates are supposed to line up here across here. So we had 3 dates in the 2000s where the numbers stayed the same. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case, and I'll talk about that in a moment. At Gualala River Bridge, this was just a breeding bird survey site where they would stop as one of the 50 3-minute stops that they make and count martins. So high variability because you're only there for three minutes, but no indication of a decline. And then in Sacramento, the population declined, which I'll show you in a minute. If you look at the regions, and evaluate the occupancy, what proportion of the sites that were present, primarily in the 1980s, the 1990s, what proportion of those sites were still occupied in 2009? And you can see that basically about 58% were still occupied. So we lost a lot of birds from a number of sites. If you look at trees and snags, that's where most of the loss occurred, which perhaps is not too surprising because snags come and go as rot occurs. But even at the permanent sites, bridges and in utility poles and towers, we lost 44% of the population. So not real good, but you know, not no, I'm sorry, not real good quality data, but not great indication of the status. Much of the Central Coast losses, where the losses were so high, again, we had relatively few sites. Most of those were bridges that became overgrown with vegetation that precluded the birds from getting inside. So it's not always something nefarious. Some of it is somewhat natural. But overall, this loss would represent lose about 3% of the sites per year being lost. Well, what are some of the recent indications of population status? Well, unfortunately, we have some negative indicators. This top left photo is Lava Beds National Monument, a really unique, interesting site where there are these underground lava tubes and caves that were formed when the lava ran out of um, whatever the source of the lava was there, which the mountain I've forgotten. But it created these underground caves. If you've ever been there, it's a really fascinating place. So the birds were nesting underground at lava beds. And they were documented to be there for almost a century, but they disappeared about 10 years ago. We thought that all this burning that was taking place would be good for martins, creating snags and open habitat. But unfortunately, the surveys that have been done, uh, which were done primarily to look for blackback woodpeckers, um, only 3 sites out of 133 that were surveyed by the Institute for Bird Populations uh, produced martins. So it appears that they're not colonizing these burned areas very readily. Um, I mentioned the Clear Lake utility corridor site, which I said was stable. Well, I went back there last year and we had seen 23 pairs in 2009. Last year there was one because the birds were nesting in these insulators that held up separated the transmission lines from each other, and they changed out the spacers, and they did those spacers didn't have holes in them, which is what the birds were nesting in. So that population disappeared, a local effect. But has that happened elsewhere? We don't really know. We had we had one nest box colony that my colleague and I started in Shelter Cove in Humboldt County. A second one appeared at Napa County about 5 years ago. And after 3 years, we had 5 pairs using them. They disappeared for unknown reasons. So that was a big disappointment because if we could get this colony, this colonial nesting in nest boxes going, that would be beneficial to the birds. And then you can see the decline in the Sacramento population, which declined by 89% from 173 pairs to 19 pairs last year over a 22-year period. The reasons for that, I searched for. This was my study, and for 10 years, I looked for reasons, tried to fathom what were the reasons for this decline. And it turns out uh, it's completely correlated with the rapid increase in the use of neonicotinoid pesticides in both agricultural and residential use in the Sacramento region. There are some positive indicators of population success. Looking at the eBird data, which I did, suggests that there's still moderate abundance in coastal forests, presumably because there's not a lot of pesticide being used there, and starlings don't like heavily forested areas. I did do some resurvey work of bridge colonies along the Mendocino coast, Highway 1. and some snag colonies there. And all of the sites that were occupied in 2009 still remain occupied. In fact, one site that had been occupied and then was unoccupied in 2009 was recolonized. Um, and the numbers there seem similar. I didn't use the recent surveys didn't use a complete protocol that we used in 2009 and we're planning to use again this year, but the numbers appear pretty similar. And then one thing that I'll talk more about that's really exciting and should be a source of local pride for you guys is this major colony that established in the Highway 101 Willits bypass. Um, and then this is not supposed to be a nested comment. Nest boxes have been occupied now in coastal Mendocino County just in the last couple of years and in Santa Clara County. And then I can't read the one at the bottom because oh oh yes, and then there's interestingly the population in the entire Sierra Nevada has pretty much disappeared south of Yuba County, which is in the north portion of the Sierra. But there's a small population that is moving north using transmission towers in the lower conifer region in Fresno County now. And so that will be interesting to watch and see whether that population expands into more natural habitat, um, whether they continue to use other tower sites and continue to move north. So conclusions regarding statewide status. In these four regions, we have substantial declines or actual outright extirpation. Central Valley, Sierra Nevada, the East and South Bay area, and then lowland, Southern California. The Central Coast region, the jury's still out a little bit. I think that the population is probably stable. That's using the snags in the conifer region. The bridge colonies have declined, but we're still seeing a fair number of birds in conifer areas. And then the North Bay area and the North Coast region, the birds still appear to be relatively abundant and the population's stable, but we'll be checking on that for our survey this year. Based on limited data, and again, why is it different? Starling abundance, insecticide use, and I would add to these inland areas, climate change, drier conditions, producing fewer insects probably is having an effect as well. So I keep mentioning this statewide survey, so let me give you a little bit of background on that. The goals of this survey are to determine the current distribution and changes in distribution of the species within the state, to evaluate the breeding size and trends in the statewide and regional populations to the extent we can do that. We're also describing the nesting habitat and the potential conflicts that arise from the various types of nesting situations. And we're going to use all this information to develop a conservation strategy and a set of specific actions that hopefully can be taken to maintain or recover this population. That picture at the bottom is looking up into one of the weep holes in the underside of a bridge, such as occurs at Willits Bypass. I'll have more pictures of that in a minute. So I mentioned that I conducted this eBird review this last year for records from 2011 to 2024. Prior to 2011, eBird wasn't used all that much, but I spent about 2 weeks going through 9,000 eBird records and searching for information. I screened out the migratory records, some of which occur while birds in California are breeding. We still have migrants moving through, going north to British Columbia and Washington. And I tried to identify sites that either had some confirmation of breeding based on the comments that appeared in the eBird records, or were likely to be breeding based on the numbers, the uh, length of time within the season, and the number of different seasons in which martins were recorded. I'm assuming all of you are somewhat familiar with what eBird is, but if you have questions, I can talk about that later. We tried to confirm breeding based on what I call diagnostic breeding behaviors. So if you see certain behaviors like birds carrying nesting material, carrying food to the nest, taking a fecal sac from the nest out to drop it away from the nest, or you hear young or see young in the holes, then you know you have a breeding pair. And also, if you repeatedly see birds, you can at a site you can generally infer that the birds are breeding, and you can count them. So based on that information and our and surveys we're going to conduct, um, well, I really didn't give you much information about the survey, but let me just say quickly, we took the eBird records, which were about 200 identified nesting sites in California, and we're going to select about 85 of those and survey them on the ground using a three-pass survey. So we get them when they're early and establishing their nesting, when they're feeding young, and then late in the season when the younger birds that start breeding later uh, bring their bird when they are feeding their young. So we'll visit these sites 3 times to come up with a population estimate. We can compare the numbers that we get in our survey to the numbers that eBird recorded during surveys over the previous 5 years, and we come up with what I'm calling an eBird correction factor. Birders, I hope nobody's insulted by this, but birders tend to underestimate colonial birds. You're busy, you're trying to get as many species as possible. You see a couple of martins, you put down 2 martins. Well, when we see martins at our survey sites, we'll spend an hour watching, counting how many adults, how many females, how many holes are being entered. And so our numbers are higher, but we can index by going to the same sites, we can index these numbers and come up with a correction factor that we can apply to the eBird data to say, well, they've reported 6, but it's actually probably 15. So we can use the correction factor to estimate the total numbers at all eBird sites. But then remember, eBirders don't get to go everywhere. Roads aren't there, it's private property. So we're then going to develop a model using density of birds at areas surveyed by eBird. So we can say, okay, there's an average of 1 bird per 1,000 acres that's covered by eBird, and we can apply that density factor to those areas that are considered suitable habitat that are not being surveyed by eBird or by us. So we can then combine the numbers from our surveys, from the eBird with the correction factor applied, and this habitat population model to derive a total estimated population for the state as a whole. And that number is important because it affects how people think about the birds. If there are 10,000 birds, it's a different story than if there are 1,000 birds. So this is important for us to try to estimate, and we should have that estimate by the end of this or shortly after the end of the field season. Well, going through these data, I'll just give you a quick look at the kinds of things that came out of eBird. This shows you the number of breeding sites and the number of breeders that eBird reported by region in the state. And what you can see here is that the coastal forest areas, as I mentioned before, the North Coast Range, the North Bay, and the Central and South Coast have most of the martins, again, because less pesticide use and fewer starlings. And the breeding is very sparsely distributed in overall. I mean, these are large areas to have only 31 pairs, known in the North Bay. But looking at the inland areas, only 5 sites known to support martins in the entire northern Sierra Nevada. So very sparse and again, not completely surveyed, but I think we'll come to the same conclusion after we complete our overall study. The numbers and the historical information suggest regional differences in status. It appears that the inland birds have declined. The coastal birds seem to be doing well. And again, just reminding you, these are the eBirded sites only. So we also could look at, well, where are the birds nesting? And unfortunately, a lot of eBirders do not report much information other than the numbers that they see. So I'm going to encourage you, if you see purple martins, would you please write down things in the notes in eBird about what are they doing? Or what kind of behavior did you observe? What kind of sites were they using? And that would be helpful to us. But based on 157 breeding sites where I was able to get information, these are the different nesting substrates that are being used. Snags and trees, about over half. Um, Utility structures, this surprised me somewhat, the number of wooden utility poles that are being used in certain areas by purple martins. And then we have quite a substantial proportion of the population using these bridge areas where, again, they're going into the undersides of the bridges through these so-called weep holes. I do want to note that snags are probably underrepresented here because people tend to say more about utility poles and bridges. And in a lot of cases, it's sort of assumed that it's a snag, but they didn't say it was, so we couldn't record it. So I think probably we'll see a higher percentage as we get more information. I mentioned the utility pole was a surprise, and then, oh yeah, we only now have 2 nest box sites that are known, both of which are within 1 mile of each other at Albion on the coast. So, kind of starting to wrap up here. Based on what we learned about these nesting substrates, there are certain threats, but also opportunities that are posed. With respect to snags, the threats consist of the loss of historical sites as snags fall and as they get removed. One of our main sites where this bird was on the top is Shelter Cove. And there was a big fire that went through there, I think it was in the 60s, and created all these snags, but they're falling down on their own. And as people are developing their residential lots, they're removing the snags. There's also, a threat, if you will, is the lack of recruitment into new burns. That unfortunately, perhaps again because of drier conditions, we're just not seeing birds move into burns. Even age management systems, clear cutting, seed tree cutting, tend to create the same, not very much difference in structure of the habitat. And, martins like to be in open areas, so they like to be in that large snag that's above the forest canopy, or even a snag that's in the middle of a clear cut. But a lot of even age management is not creating habitat that the birds can use. There are opportunities in terms of snag management. If where we have burns that are in cooler, wetter areas, those areas could be creating snags as they did at Shelter Cove. And if we can recognize that, we can put more management attention in those areas where martins are more likely to occur. There's also the opportunity to recruit snags in clear cuts. You guys may know more about logging than the general population, but one system used for even age management are seed trees, where they clear cut a patch of forest, but they leave 1 or 2 trees per acre to be the seed source for the next generation of trees. Well, oftentimes those seed trees are then removed once the new seedlings begin to grow, but those could be retained and managed as snags. for martins. Again, it doesn't have to be everywhere, but in areas where it's likely that martins could benefit. With respect to utility structures, the threats include one that I've only come to, well, that I mentioned to you for Clear Lake is this change from more suitable to less suitable transmission line structures. And we just don't know the extent to which that is happening, whether Clear Lake was an isolated incident or some sort of a trend. One thing that is clear is that wooden poles, like this one being used by this male martin, are being replaced by these wire wrapped poles, poles with this hardware cloth wire put on it, specifically to discourage woodpeckers from making holes. So as these poles become less and less sound, there's potential for outages and such. And so when they are considered threatened, they're removed, but they're replacing them with a pole that is not going to become suitable in the future. Undergrounding of utility lines obviously is another source of loss of poles if they are removed. But the opportunities do exist if we could coordinate effectively with utilities to leave the old poles in place when they put a new one in, and possibly to add nest boxes in areas that are being used, where poles are being used by martins. Finally, then, with respect to bridges, this picture here shows you construction that occurring at a Sacramento colony site. And you can see these upside down cones are excluders to prevent birds from entering the holes. And they did block off all the holes that were being used by 2 of the 5 remaining colonies. But we managed to coordinate with them and get those removed, and the birds have remained and have been nesting successfully in these holes, despite all this construction activity going on right nearby. So threats include one is replacement of suitable designs, the designs that are called the hollow Bach girder design structure that have these weep holes, with other designs that don't provide nesting opportunities. Disturbance during construction and maintenance can be a problem, but almost as insidious is the excessive exclusion of birds during construction, as I described here. Had they not removed these, we would have lost those birds. Perhaps they would have gone somewhere else, but this is where they chose to be. And it turned out they did quite well with all this construction activity. So getting, this exclusion really is not a means of protecting birds from construction. It's a way to protect construction from birds. Because if birds start nesting, there's a threat that these sites could be shut down for construction. So in this case, we did it all informally, but we had to get agreement from the agencies, Caltrans, Fish and Wildlife, that this was worth trying. And if it didn't work, nobody was going to be punished. And that's the only reason we were able to get these removed. And it worked great because the birds did come, they tolerated the disturbance, and bred successfully. Another problem with bridges is that it's a place where homeless encampments occur. And we've had some major fires because we have some major encampments under some of these bridge areas. Caltrans has apparently taken a new, I guess there was a new law passed that allows removal of homeless camps more readily, and Caltrans has been cleaning those areas up. I'm not unsympathetic to homeless people, but it is a management problem at Purple Martin colonies, and to some degree, a safety issue for those of us monitoring them. But there are opportunities here as well. Better activity coordination, as we had with Caltrans on this project. I mean, I've been trying to get Caltrans to pay attention to martins for 20 years, and with very little success. And finally, with this project, they finally understood, and the biologists got excited. And I did training for 20, 30 biologists, and now they've got religion and they're doing great things. So it took a long time, but we have made progress with Caltrans. Another thing that is an opportunity that might be contemplated at Willets Bypass, for example, is installing these so-called nest guards. So one of the potential drawbacks, or it is a drawback, of these vertical weep holes is that the young tend to congregate around the entrances and fall out sometimes. And so you lose a certain amount of reproduction. On average, it's about one bird per three nests. But a very creative guy from California, Audubon, came up with this idea of putting these little wire sleeves in and creating a railing. So it's pushed up above the edge, the bottom edge of the hole or the top edge of the hole. And it creates a little railing so that they're less likely to fall out. And those could be installed if needed to increase reproduction. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the State Route 101 bypass. Actually, Maricela was going to talk about it, but she's tending to a baby, not hers, her daughters, I guess, or sons, I forgot. Anyway, State Route 101 Willets bypass. So this area that I am guessing most of you know was completed. Construction was completed in, I guess, in over stages in 2014 to 2016. It's about 4.2 miles long, and about 1.5 miles of it are elevated, thereby creating these, with this hollow box girder structure, creating these holes beneath. The first use of the bridge by Martins was only in 2021, so that's like 4 years ago. And I learned about this and from a friend of mine at Caltrans, one of my Martin protectors, Martin fan club members, and he connected me with Maricela, and she reported to me, "Oh, we've got lots of Martins," and so I worked with her on teaching her the methods for censusing the birds, which again involve mapping what holes the birds are going in and out of over time and identifying diagnostic nesting behaviors. And I made a visit out there last July, the 11th and 12th, and we worked together to figure out the numbers of birds. So there's Maricela in the field. This is not her data sheet, it's mine. Um, but I thought you just might be amused to see how we actually do this. We make a map, first of all, and then you assign numbers and letters so that every hole has a unique identifier. And then we just record for each hole how many males, that's just after second year males, the adult males, how many females, how many second year males, how many unidentified birds go into each of these holes, and what kinds of behaviors are they exhibiting. This one was carrying food, and we heard young calling. We heard them in the nest. So by recording this stuff and then putting it in a spreadsheet over time, you can come up with a population estimate. And our mapping showed that 27 pairs of birds were using that Willett site. I mentioned about the eBird correction factor. The highest number that had been reported in eBird for this site before we censused it was, I believe, 8 birds. And so we found 54 birds. And it just goes to show you that, especially in these big sites, it's very challenging unless you execute a pretty rigorous protocol. So how significant is this area? Well, guess what? This is the largest known colony site in California. Shelter Cove had close to the same numbers, but a lot of those were in nest boxes that have not been maintained because the person that helped us moved away. So this is probably the largest colony in California. Its large size, it results from really ideal conditions. You have abundant nest holes. There are over 100, at least 100 holes in this bypass structure that birds can use. But most importantly is the insect supply that these grassland and wetland areas are producing that the birds can use. So this rapid adoption, going from no birds or maybe a few birds in 2021 to 74 birds in 2024, is really astounding. And that rapid adoption indicates a healthy regional population because birds had to be coming in from other areas. This couldn't just have grown so quickly from just one pair of birds that colonized. So it suggests that there are other birds being produced, enough birds that they're looking for new places to grow. It also indicates that this colony is highly successful reproductively, and reproduction, again, because of lack of insects, has been a major source of decline in other areas. So you really have a very unique and very moving area. I went out to that site, and it was like all of the colonies were in Sacramento 20 years ago, where there's so many birds flying around and so many holes being entered, you just could barely track it. And that's completely disappeared. Now in Sacramento, now our colonies are 2, 3, 4 pairs. So this really took me back to the good old days, and I hope that this will continue. I might just mention there's you people know that probably that there's a new bridge being built on Highway 20, and now I'm forgetting the name of where it is there, but it's I think at the north end of Lake Mendocino, and I think that's going to be a Martin magnet also, and that's something to keep an eye on because it's long, it's very open, it's next to water, and I would predict that it should be filling up with martins over the next 3, 4 years. So that I think is all I had for tonight, and I guess I did fill up my time. So I hope I didn't put you all to sleep. And if you have questions or anything, or if corrections, if there are things you want to correct me on, please let me know.
Can I first ask everyone to give a big hand to Dan? Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. Folks, I invite you to unmute if you want to say your thanks orally.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Great show. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Great show.
I
Great.
Thank you.
think the new bridge is in Redwood Valley.
Yeah.
It's right. It's almost over to Highway 101
Yeah.
on Highway 20, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
Redwood Valley.
Yeah. Well, watch that place. I bet it'll go. Shall I stop sharing here? And
Yeah,
just so
that
we can
sounds
see each other?
good. We have a number
Okay.
of questions in the chat, but we
Oh
also
my gosh, look at all these people.
people.
Wow.
Oh, Chuck's got his, or actually, that's the Mendo Coast Audubon Society is raising their hand. So if you want to unmute and ask.
Okay, I was trying to clap my hands, I think.
Ah,
This is Tim.
Hi, Tim. How's it going?
Nice presentation, Dan.
Thank you. Tim has birds in boxes. He's one of 2 people in the state with birds in boxes. So he's a celebrity in this little world that I live in.
It's not me, it's the birds. They're the celebrities. Yeah, and they used, it was super weird that they used boxes designed for other kinds of birds. For everybody else's benefit, one pair nested in a barn owl nest box and the other pair in a kestrel nest box, neither of which have ever been used by the target species. So that was
Well, and Tim, that's an indicator of population health. I mean, it's one data point, but my friend Stan Koska and I have been putting up nest boxes in a variety of settings where martins have been present and not present for quite some time, and they and very few of those get used, even though they're designed specifically for martins. And the reason is the populations just aren't producing enough birds to force them to go look for new
Oh,
housing.
right. Yeah.
So this is, you know, I think somebody's talking that's maybe wants to be muted. I'll leave that up to you. But okay, what else?
Hey Dan, this is Larry Jordan. I'm with Shasta Birding Society,
Yeah,
and
hi Larry.
how you doing? Good. I'm sorry I missed the beginning of this of the whole show, but it's fantastic that you're getting all these swallows, martins, I should say, houses. So I was just curious because I monitor 70 nest boxes here in the Reading area. Do the swallows will they actually use like Western bluebird size boxes? Or what size boxes? You just mentioned that they've been using other types of bird boxes.
Yeah, well, it's it's not a simple answer. I mean, they use a whole size bigger than a Western bluebird. Um, and I forgot the exact dimension. I should know it, but I think it's like 3 5/8 inch diameter. Um,
So they would want
and
a
you know
larger
the
size
goal
box.
is the goal is to exclude starlings while allowing martins to use the hole, and it has to be a pretty specific uh, vertical distance because starlings have a bigger uh, breastbone, and you can exclude them if you get the diameter correct. So some people use round holes, but starlings are more likely get into round holes. If you don't have starlings, you don't have to worry about that, and round holes are probably more attractive to martins. But if you have starlings, what my friend Stan uses, he manages colonies in Washington, and he uses actually a rectangular hole that has the proper vertical dimension. I gave one of those boxes to Tim. He has it, and we can get designs and things for you. But you know, it is challenging getting martins. Uh, as I sometimes say, you know, you can get martins to use boxes where you least need them to use boxes. Um,
Right.
you know,
Yeah, in locations where there are natural cavities, right?
yeah, and they're already abundant. Yeah,
But
but I think we need to start this as another uh, kind of insurance policy. You know, a way to help bolster the population a bit. So
Yeah.
I will say I did hear of a pair nesting in lowlands in Reading. Um, which really surprised me. And I don't know that the birds persisted, but somebody who I trust told me they had birds nesting in the back their grandmother's backyard in downtown Reading. So,
Oh,
which
no
is
kidding.
possible. Yeah.
I'll have to look into that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Dan, can I read you a few questions from the chat?
Sure.
Chuck asks, will you survey the nesting site at Windy Gap in Mendocino National Forest in your statewide survey?
I forgot right now. I think Windy Gap, I know that we identified it certainly as as a colony site. There are a lot of records there, as I assume Chuck knows. One of the challenges is just the time, travel time required, and we have money enough this year from Cal Fish and Wildlife. Let's give them credit to hire two biologists to conduct the surveys. And I'm actively working with the Institute for Bird Populations, who's going to run the survey crew to sort of decide which sites we will and won't get out there. Because if you choose to do it, you have to go 3 times. And if it's really remote, you can't do other sites in the nearby area. So we're kind of picking and choosing right now. And I'm sorry, I just can't remember Windy Gap. I could look, but then I'd be distracted here. I should also say, though, I mean, I would love for people to go on out and do this. And if anyone has interest in trying to follow the protocol, I have cooperators in Santa Barbara County, in San Mateo County. I think I mentioned that Sarah Grimes is going to be doing surveys on the Mendocino coast. So if others, even just doing e-birding and getting information in eBird is great. It's helpful. If you want to actually do the protocol and follow it, I can provide that to people, and they can help us that way.
Returning to the chat, Helen asked if there was any competition with between bats and martins for the underbridge nesting sites.
I have never observed that. I've heard people say that bats will go in the weep holes, um, but what I observe are the bats using what's called the expansion joints, which are these little narrow cracks that run between sections of the bridge that allow the bridge to expand and contract a small amount when they heat and cool, and maybe, for earthquakes. I mean, I'm not a bridge engineer, but I usually see them in those narrow cracks. I've been told that they sometimes use weep holes. We did some limited camera work up inside, and we didn't see bats, but we weren't really looking up. We were looking, up and straight ahead. So I can't say for sure, but I don't think there'd be competition. No, there would not be competition because these structures are so large. If you think about it, what they are these long sections of vertical walls that run along the road, the same direction as the road, to hold up the roadbed on the top. So you've got every, I think it's every 12 feet, there's a wall that goes along, and it creates a box that is very large, like 30 meters, 90 feet long or 60 feet long and 5 feet wide. So there's a ton of space there, and the bats would be up and martins would be down. So shouldn't be a problem. And they feed at different times, so they're probably feeding on different insects too.
I'll let Dave ask his own questions. I know he had a couple good ones.
Sure.
I couldn't tell if you were talking about this or not, but on the south side of Clear Lake, up above the highway, there used to be some utility poles, and the martins were nesting not in the poles themselves, but it was part of the hardware or part of the structure that came out. You were familiar with those?
That's the one I was talking about. It's Red Hills Road.
Yeah.
It goes kind of up the hill through a vineyard, and it was I guess a fairly low voltage transmission line. And they had these spacers, or insulators they call them, which were these arms that stick out from the pole that were about maybe 4 or 5 inches in diameter, and they had a little hole at the bottom of them, and the birds would go up inside there and nest. Well, when I went back and that's where the 23 pairs were nesting. I went back last year, they had changed out all of those insulators to something that didn't have any holes except at one site. And there was one pair of martins left nesting at that site.
Okay, I had observed those and taken photos of them, and I wondered if that was the same thing that I was thinking of that you'd seen and were
Yep.
discussing.
And, I mean, I don't know whether anybody paid any attention, but I have a feeling that no one ever even worried about that when they made those changes. And, that shouldn't be happening to a species that's considered a species of special concern, a declining species under the California Environmental Quality Act. Those species should be getting consideration. And I don't think it happened there. I can't tell you 100% with 100% certainty, but.
And then I had a question about a colony that I observed up in Del Norte County on the ocean side of Lake Earl.
Yeah.
You're familiar with that. I think it was around 15 years ago. I counted about 35 or 40 martins in the trees, and I went back later, and that had disappeared, and I can never really find any the last few times I went back. Did that disappear completely? You were aware of that?
There are some records there, and we do have a site we're planning to survey there. We've selected one of several apparent sites there. I haven't been there, but I will say a couple of things. One is that water, reservoirs, lakes, ponds sometimes attract large numbers of birds from substantial distances that go there in the evening to drink and to and sometimes to collect grit and socialize. And so you see these records of these large numbers of birds, and I've gone through them one by one saying, has anybody seen one in a hole? Has anyone seen, is there any indication of breeding? And oftentimes you don't find that. So another thing I would say is that when temperatures get cold and insect abundance declines, in response to cold temperatures, swallows, including martins, tend to go to water bodies because the water heats the air and it concentrates the insect. So those are reasons why you may have numbers of birds at water bodies that are not necessarily breeding right there. Lake
I
Earl
saw
is
the
also
bird.
on the migration route along the coast because there are quite a few birds that do migrate right adjacent to the coast.
I
So I
I
don't
saw
know
the
for sure, but there are some birds nesting there, and we're going to survey some
I
of them this year.
I saw lots of birds going in and out of the cavities in the trees. And
If you want to send me a precise location, I would love to have it,
and
and maybe we can check it. We're going to be there.
well, after that, I went and looked at a lot of trees along our own coast that looked to be identical, and I never could find any, you know, even though it seemed like it was the right kind of site, the right kind of trees. Uh, the only time I ever saw them like that was that one occasion, and up in Del Norte, and
Yeah.
it
Well, I mean, another thing about colonial species is that they aren't, um, their occurrence isn't as predictable as you might think. You think, oh, for a lot of birds that you look at it, good birders, you look at it and you say, oh, there's got to be, hairy woodpeckers here, and there are. But with martins, you can often say, this looks like a great spot, and they're not there. And that might be because, they're all congregated a mile or two or three away because they want to be together and they're able to travel substantial distances. So the predictability of where they occur is not as high as for many other species. But
I just
I can tell you some places on the coast where they use snags. North of Fort Bragg, there's a group of redwood snags between Fort Bragg and 10 Mile. Uh, it's called Little Valley Road, and there's about three pairs of birds using redwood snags. There's some at a place called Enchanted Forest within McCarricker Park, and there's some using snags Casper at Casper Creek, um, near near Highway 1 there on Casper Creek Road, I think it's called. So there's still a few, and there's quite a few in snags out there. Hard to find though, because they're hard to see in dense cover.
are you interested in receiving photos if we have photos of birds going in and out of cavities or being in cavities?
Sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, especially if you have good locational information. I mean, I would believe you if you just told me you saw them going in and out, but but the most important thing is where is it? And can we go back and look and see if they're still there? That kind of thing. And we can't cover all the sites, but of about 200 sites, we're trying to get to 85 and the larger sites. So we're surveying about 80% of the population that that is recorded in eBird right now, which is a subset of the total population, obviously.
I want to ask one more question from the chat, and also I owe a lot of you a big apology, especially Dan. We inadvertently had two different links in the email we sent out inviting people to this Zoom. So apologies to all of you who ended up on the wrong Zoom first. And the one more question I want to read from the chat is Eloise asks, is there a good nest box pattern specifically for purple martins?
Yes, but I have it, but I need to put it somewhere. So maybe I'll send it to you and you can put it up on your website.
I think people would love that. Thank you.
Okay. I know we need to get that organized. You know, the work that there's a group called the Purple Martin Conservation Association that is really working to promote the nest box programs in the East. And we sort of need a subsidiary of that to work with people on boxes here. But it's the kind of thing where, well, we don't have any, so nobody wants to put resources toward it. You know, the birds in Albion are really the genesis of what I hope will be an expanding, hobbyist activity in getting more birds in boxes. And I'll get you those, but I can't do everything, and sometimes stuff that's important still falls to the side.
Well, thank you, Dan, for all you do and for joining us tonight.
It was my pleasure. Thanks to all of you for so many of you. I mean, I'm really surprised by the number of people coming out from interior Mendocino County. You're out polling, like Golden Gate Audubon Society. So hats off to you for your interest, and I appreciated talking with you, and maybe I'll see you at the Willits Bypass sometime this summer.
Fantastic. Just
All
to let
right.
folks know, our next Audubon presentation will be in person, March 18th, back at City Council chambers, and that's going to be in person only, so please come if you can.
Yeah, and I'm sure Maricela is would be willing to have a field trip out there for those who haven't seen the Willits situation. I mean, it's really wild. It's really worth going and checking out. And maybe we can arrange it so I can be out there to do a field trip for you guys as well sometime this summer or
That'd be
spring.
fantastic.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Take care. Have a good night.